so that we,
It's a button.
so everybody can hear us.
Yeah, green lights on.
All right, I'm going to call a meeting of June 24th of the Ojai Basin Groundwater Management Agency to order at 3:01 p.m. I'm going to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. We can do that again.
How about that?
Pledge allegiance to the flag
To the flag of the United States of America,
and to the
to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible,
indivisible,
with
with
liberty
and
and
justice for all.
justice for all.
Okay, let me get my cheat sheet out here. All right, the next item is, we have to call the roll.
Director Barber,
Here.
Director Aieva,
Here.
Director Daddy,
Here,
Director Duffy, and Chair Hager.
Here.
We have a quorum. Thank you.
All right, director announcements.
Just real quick, I'm sorry, before you get into that.
Sure.
I would like on the agenda to pull item 8F. Director Thilke and I that's a discussion about the board recommend, or the director representation for the mutuals. And as you know, Director Thilke is an alternate, and he's been on in that position a lot longer. And he and I had a long discussion about it. So we'd like to bring that back at a different date once he does a little bit of homework on his end.
Okay, thank you. Emily, do you have anything to report on the Ojai Water Conservation District?
No, they did meet. I was out of town, and the Ojai Water Conservation District is in the position to pay some rent back to OBGMA, which will be $1,800 a year. And then I'll also say I'm on the Upper Ventura Groundwater Agency as the ag representative, and we too have also posted some chapter drafts on our website, and it would be great if people could read them and look at them and give us comments and thoughts and compare and contrast to the chapters of here too. So good information. We're both doing the same, similar things, very different geology.
Yeah, I've attended some of those meetings, and we're pretty much in parallel on this, so
Yeah.
it's good. City of, anything else?
That's all.
A couple comments. One is we're in active discussion in the city. When we get into our street overlay program, part of that is the increasing amount of information we're getting from the in-stream flow grant study about where the opportunities for capturing stormwater and recharge are in the city's hardscape, and trying to integrate that into our street overlay program. So when we're doing a street where that's involved or that opportunity arises, we include that in the design for enhancing recharge. The other point I want to make is, as I know we've been not normal, but as we get back to normal, I want to note that I checked the OBGMA website today and had on upcoming meetings, I think it had an 8/19 posting.
Yeah,
And we probably needed to start, as we get back to normal, paying attention on keeping that up to date.
right. Thank you. I agree. We've got a lot to do. I had Roberta update the directors that were on there. We were still listing directors that weren't no longer on the board, and so
Just a gentle.
yeah, no, we appreciate that. Thank you.
Hey, Bill?
Can I add one thing
No.
since we talked about the
Sure.
website? I think it would be really great to get a interested parties email list on there if people are interested in hearing about the meetings.
Okay.
As we get further along with the plan, people should be able to know when new chapters are posted, et cetera. So,
And we do have a list. We just don't have anything posted specifically on the site, which I wouldn't recommend, but we should have the opportunity for people to say, hey, here's my email address. I'd like to be on your list. And I think that's what you're asking for.
exactly.
Okay.
Okay. For Casitas, we had a board meeting yesterday, and we adopted our 2021-22 budget, operating budget, as well as the 2020 Urban Water Management Plan. So if you're interested in any of those, you can review them. The budget is difficult to review, to say the least. But the Urban Water Management Plan, I think the staff there did a really good job. In a short period of time, they had to do it because we went through changing the safe yield and the projected demands only about 90 days before that thing was due. So they did a good job of updating it and making it work.
And it's formally adopted now?
Yes.
Great, that's wonderful. Very timely for our housing element
Mm-hmm.
resource part of the housing element as well. So
Yeah,
good.
they're due July 1st, so
Great.
everyone has to have theirs completed by
Thank you.
then.
Great.
And OHI is a separate unit.
Okay.
It's identified by the state as a separate
Right.
residential unit, so they just kept it that way for now. We'll
But is
probably-
adopted by, we can adopt it by reference into our
Yes.
housing element? Okay.
Yes.
Great.
Okay, and the community service district, Bob.
Well, I'm not sure how accurate this is going to be, but understand I had a reporter on 13 hours listening to the court documents. And evidently, the Channel Keepers is no longer going to be part of the lawsuit, which started the lawsuit. But Ventura is going to continue to vigorously pursue their suit with us up here, even though they no longer have an excuse to do that because they're fighting off the Channel Keepers. Pretty interesting scenario. So we'll keep an eye on it, and we'll see where it goes from here. But I thought that thing was Monday, and I honestly, Richard, I would have thought that you folks would have had that information at the Casitas meeting on Wednesday, which we also monitored. So, hopefully that'll come up and we can get a clear understanding of where we are in this adjudication effort. Looks like it's going to be full on. Just Channel Keepers are set aside. So that's my understanding. That's all I've got from the district.
All right. For the record, Peter Theckley is here and owes us an update.
I've got some really exciting news. Nothing.
Okay?
We are struggling with this drought as everybody else is.
Okay, general manager's comments?
I just have one item that I wanted to mention, and I've got another item, but I'll wait till the calendar discussion later. I had emailed Peter Candy, the agency's attorney, asking questions about, now that we're back in formal attendance, and concerns about directors attending by Zoom and not being within the jurisdiction of the agency. So apparently, up at least until September 30th, the governor's executive order related to the COVID that allowed us to do a lot of the Zoom meetings and things of that nature is still in place. So, but if and when that ends, and unless the governor makes some changes in the law after September 30, we're going to need to make sure that directors are attending the meeting either by Zoom or physically in the chamber within the jurisdiction of OBGMA. So if they're outside the jurisdiction of OBGMA, they can still attend, but they have to post a notice that there's a meeting available and post it on their door. And I'm not sure if, Bill, you mentioned earlier, Director Rywick, you mentioned earlier, I think, do you have to let the public?
That was was a rule, but I think it's been waived
Okay.
temporarily.
Yeah.
If you were Zooming in, you had to post it as a public place, so
But I
others
think,
could come in and watch you or something.
yeah, that's the thing. So you're posting it on your family's door at their house or at the hotel room or something, and you have to make it accessible to the public, which I don't think anybody's going to do. But I've been that route with directors before in an agency I worked with previously. So just we're keeping an eye on this, and we'll let you know what transpires when all the governor's executive order expires and if there's any changes in law.
Okay. Anything else?
No.
Okay, Jordan, is Jordan with us?
Yes, I am via Zoom. So if I can share the screen, we can get our presentation going today.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. Okay, so today's presentation, that I always like to mix up the title a little bit, as you know. Hopefully, the title is only one of the interesting things that comes along here, and I find that to be the case for myself. But today I'm going to talk about the dynamic times, but static water, Ojai Basin conditions, and then also the Southern Monitoring Well update for the Wildlife Conservation Board granted depth discrete monitoring well that has just been completed this past week. So you'll get some pretty real-time information out of this, and we'll continue, of course, over the course of the entirety of the monitoring period. On the source of all of our water here, local rainfall, 2021 water year, very, very low, still barely above that 4.35 from 1947. What I like to do here is talk a bit about where the storms hit us, and really there were all of sort of 3 storms all year long. A little bit at the end of December, a little bit at the end of January, and then mid-March. Really, really low by any comparison. And I think that's important because when we talk about recharge to the basin, steady, continuous rainfall of low total volume can be highly effective, or of course, big wet years with single big storms can be pretty effective, like 2010 to 11, a year that saw pretty much 10 straight days of rain following the winter solstice, but artesian conditions in the spring, despite relatively low rainfall in later 2011. So the intensity and the interspersement of storm tracks is important, as well as the low totals, and we have sort of the worst of both conditions here. So it's definitely dry. We definitely didn't get a lot of recharge. We did get some, but for the most part, it's recession. What that means for the basin as a whole, monitoring via the key well and discharge points. Here's the as of this week's download from the Elrod well. You can see the blue line just continue to trend downward, almost right on track with a brief intermittence following the 2020 peak. We're pumping more frequently. We get more drawdown in those lower periods of time. But importantly, this is where we're at. We're not yet as low as our peak from 2015. We're at 159.29 feet below depth, below ground surface at that Elrod well. We calculate a 68% basin capacity, or 56,000 acre feet. We're down almost 20 feet from our February 13th, 2021 high, and dropping pretty quick. So we should be obviously well aware that this is not stopping anytime soon, and that our annual nadir, depending on how much precipitation we get, summer monsoonal type stuff, or early fall, could be pretty intense this year. The question was raised this past month, and it's a question we get from time to time. How do you figure out what the status of a basin is with a single well? And obviously, we use numerous wells in this endeavor, but it really boils down to what's the simplest and easiest and really quickest, most efficient way to get an idea about what the quantity of water is in storage in the basin by using the key well. And many basins in the world are really managed this way, but we've used this sort of historically for really the past 30 or so years. It's based on the model grid, a 12-cell polygon grid that was established by Stahl, Gardner, and Dunn in 1992. And it's something that the county really used in earnest for really the ensuing 20 years to estimate the basin status. And as the county kind of backed off of that 10 years ago or so, we continued to use the same method. to really empirically estimate the quantity of water within the basin. It was based on a variable specific yields from 3% to 6% and aquifer thicknesses as delineated by Stahl, Gardner, and Dunn in the county preceding them. And it's also really been corroborated by aquifer testing data that we did in the early 2000s. And it intends to provide a real quick time evaluation of the conditions so that we can support really quick management decisions for the basin. And it's something that can certainly be linked and updated as the basin understanding improves and additional data are available, especially as part of the GSP. But the graph here on the right is what you'd expect, that as the depth to water in the Key Well gets deeper, there's less amount of water in storage in the basin. It tends to follow this line descending to the right. And what we would expect is that if water levels got very, very deep, that line would increase in slope. That is, you would, as the basin is narrower at its base, and the amount of water in storage is less as water levels decline faster, that line would increase in slope or continue to go downward faster should water levels decline to historic lows. We're on this graph, we're still 100 feet above that, of course, and today's is right about there in that circle. Down on the discharge side, this past week we conduct the mapping of the daylighting of the water, and it really is literally in the weeds, in the reeds in San Antonio Creek. And as we get further downstream, it of course increases. As we monitor what's going on in Montgomery Creek, draining the city, and down by the discharge point of surface flow from the basin, we have been taking these photographs, and I think it's interesting to kind of go through this from a standpoint of how things are changing. Now, there are two things that really jump out at me in this sequence of photos that I'll show, and pay attention and see if you can see what's happening since March in the past 3 months, what's happening. There's the March photo. There's April. Here's May. And here's this week. What's obvious to me and to most is say, oh, well, the creek doesn't have any water in it now coming out of the underneath Creek Road there from this drainage. And that's true. The more astute observers may say, aha, there's a bit more graffiti on the right-hand side under the bridge. And, oh, that's to be expected. But what jumped out at me today as I was looking through this is look at the stand of Arundo there on the right-hand side, on the opposite side of the bridge. Look how large that stand is today. Let me go back in time a little bit, if I can here. Let's see. We go previous, that's April, and one more so that you can see. Now pay attention to how that Arundo has grown. This is the issue of the invasive species. So if you just look in that area on the right-hand side of the frame on the opposite side of the bridge, not the intent of taking this photograph over the past few months, but watch that Arundo grow. And that's something that is the invasive species that's trying to be out of there. How does that correlate with the amount of water in the creek? Well, obviously the Arundo gets bigger and the creek gets drier. And it's sort of an interesting snapshot a series of snapshots really about what that invasive species is doing to the watershed. Over on the main discharge channel side, this is where San Antonio Creek goes through the bedrock, just downstream from the Arroyo Preta Santa Ana Fault. Again, here's March, getting into April, and then May, and today. Really doesn't look that much different. And in fact, the water spread across is pretty similar. It's a little bit shallower, of course, now, and a little bit less flow. But by a little bit less flow, this is what we mean. So over the course of the period that we've been monitoring this with this frequency, this is the lowest flow we've quantified via this method. This is 0.16 CFS, but that still calculates to about 10 acre feet per month that is leaving the basin in this means. It's not a small amount of water, but it is important from a standpoint of habitat and consistency. Despite water levels dropping significantly in the production portion of the basin, we still see this outflow. Water year to date, about 263 acre feet discharged as we've measured here. And again, that snapshot, and these typically are taken in the middle of the day, so I would expect these to be conservative, and the actual outflow could be more. So this is a graph that we show from time to time to put this in perspective. Whoops. And the idea here is that on the top, there's several data points here, and it'll get more complex as we add more data to this, specifically with the new depth discrete monitoring well in play. The top chart is daily rainfall. This is basically back from 2017, and you can see how dry it's really been for the past couple of years since that relatively wetter year. Drought more or less ending in 2016 and then getting the wet 2017 and wetter than this past year for the preceding three. But the idea is that after 2019, you see a significant amount of flow, both of surface water and recharge in the groundwater basin, and relatively similar peaks in 2020, but 2021 being much drier. So in the center graph here, we have a number of data points that are shown. On the x-axis is still time, 2017, 18, 19, 20, 21, and to today. The discharge rate of San Antonio Creek, as measured by the county, is on the right y-axis. That's logarithmic and in CFS, and that's what's really shown in the light pink bars of the chart. The blue, light blue, is where we've mapped continuous flow across the basin, and the light blue squares, connected by a light blue line, are where we've actually mapped every month the elevation of daylighting groundwater in San Antonio Creek. So obviously when it goes all the way across the basin, that elevation is continuous. It's over 880 feet in elevation at the headwaters, but it comes down as low as very near the discharge point, but it's never past that discharge point at the spill point of the basin where the creek crosses San Antonio Creek, Arroyo Prieto Fault. The depth to water in the key well, the Elrod well, is continuously measured. That's the slightly darker blue, and the blue diamonds that are actual sounder measurements as opposed to the automated logger measurements that we get. So you can see what that curve looks like, but also how that has remained relatively higher than the San Antonio Creek discharge point in elevation, but not significantly maintaining the same levels that you would expect if this was a directly connected system. And that's really where we're going here. The instantaneous discharge we began monitoring mid-2019 in this fashion, and that is shown in the magenta X's, also plotting on the right y-axis in CFS. Very low, in fact, the recent year lows in the past couple of months. What we're adding to this now is the depths to water, or the elevation of groundwater surface in the newly constructed depth discrete monitoring well. These are pre-development, pre-pumping, and pre-stressing conditions of this well, but right off the bat, we see that perched aquifer elevation of the water table is in that yellow triangle right there. That's the highest of those elevations. And then some 40 feet deeper are the main production zones and some of the intermediate aquifers that we found within the confining layer. Now, hopefully I've whetted your appetite a bit with, wow, what does this mean? What do we know about this depth discrete monitoring well? Well, let's get into that. All right, so this going through the completed efforts, this was funded by the Wildlife Conservation Board, the grant for this part of the Ventura River in-stream flow work. It was a permitted well, permitting through as many agencies as you could imagine. We have, of course, the OBGMA issuing a permit. We have the city of Ojai issuing a well permit. We have the city of Ojai issuing an encroachment permit to allow this well to be drilled within the parkway between the curb and the sidewalk in South Fulton Street. And of course, the county well permit. This is for any monitoring well that's drilled in the county. So that's not an inexpensive endeavor, nor lacking time consumption, which really pushed us into the time frame when we did, and pushed the driller that we ended up selecting based on availability. So the well was drilled over about a 2-week period from the beginning of June to mid-June this year, just in the past couple of weeks. And of course, geologic logging that we conducted via the continuous cores of the basin for the first time, really seeing those. It's the deepest sonic well that I know of that's been drilled in the basin, the deepest well that has had continuous cores retrieved. And importantly, most wells that are drilled within the basin are drilled via rotary methods. They really churn up and crunch up the cuttings, the rocks, the sands, the gravels, and the cobbles and the boulders. And that was one of the things that surprised me about this, is how many boulders were at such depth within the basin. Something that you don't really see when you're not drilling things via cable tool methods that haven't been done probably in 50 plus years in the basin. So this is a great opportunity to see that. The future efforts that are still going on here, we need to develop this well, or this series of wells within the nested monitoring well. We need to pump the well to really clear up that material and get an idea about drawdown and production rates in the various aquifers. And that's important from a discharge to surface water standpoint. And also conduct water quality sampling, of course. We want to compare what's in that perch system versus what's in the deeper system versus what's in the intermediate system, and what's coming out in San Antonio Creek and the major production zones of the basin. We will be continually logging the water levels here, same as we are in the other wells within the basin. But at one point, we do now have 4 data loggers recording every 90 minutes within this particular well. There's also the potential to do some geophysical logging downhole. We can do dual induction logging or gamma ray logging, sonic logging even, to really get something to correlate from this particular well to other wells that are drilled in this portion of the basin. And of course, quite a bit of reporting, not just to this body on a monthly basis, but as part of the grant agreement, we have an obligation to report to the Wildlife Conservation Board. All right, so where is this well? It's right on South Fulton Street. It's really very close to the OBGMA offices, just due south of us here. It's an area where the perched aquifer is known to exist, had accessible property, and wasn't really right next to any major production wells. Now, the first step was to get utility clearance and manually excavate. I still have a blister from doing that manual excavation healing. But what was interesting about this is that Julie Tumlight was observing this as I was excavating this manual portion of the borehole. And if you don't know Julie, she's one of the local Chumash elders, and was there to just observe what we were coming up with and make sure that we weren't encountering any artifacts of significance, or any artifacts of all for that matter, which we did not. And it was nice to have great conversations with her about water and the people's history in the area. And if you ever get a chance, she's a great woman to speak with and listen to, more importantly. But we didn't encounter any utility lines. We didn't encounter any issues that would impede the progress of this well. And that's important. Once we get to the surface and the drilling rig mobilizes, ABC Leoven is one of the, I'd say, top-notch drilling outfits in Southern California, and their attention to detail is sort of evident in this particular graphic. They really take very good care of the surrounding areas. They're very conscientious about cleanliness and safety, and protecting even off the zones that they'll be actually drilling in. So that's a visqueen plastic liner that goes down to prevent oil leakage, to prevent mud encroachment, to keep the sidewalk clean and the adjacent property as well. When the rig tower's up, it's relatively small. It only goes up about 30 or so feet from the table of the of the system. You can see quite a bit in this image, but squeezed in between two sycamore trees and the street and the sidewalk is this borehole, and it's a very pretty well self-contained, very surprisingly quiet drilling operation, very powerful, and you can see the support truck over here on the left with all of the pipe. It's enclosed, it's not open, it's not subject to vandalism or damage to the environment or falling out of the drill rig. The actual rig itself is on the bed of this flatbed truck, and the sonic head is located right here. That does all the vibrations that ultrasonically break down the boulders, the cobbles, etc. And it all, when the cuttings come out, the core is discharged, shaken out of the core barrel and comes off to the front of the rig, where we then log it, and the rest of the cuttings go into this little hopper here, located right underneath. It's sort of like a little outhouse for drill cuttings to come out and and then be taken off via forklift to either the dump site or another transfer truck that can take the cuttings to, in some cases, my house, in some cases other places where fill was needed on other projects. Here's an image of the cutting bit that is right at the tip of the rods, and it's something that comes in various diameters. We had 10.5-inch diameter, we had 8-inch diameter, 6-inch diameter, and a core barrel bit, all of which had a very similar cutting tooth here. This isn't your typical tricone bit that you see in most water well drilling applications, or oil well drilling applications for that matter. This is an ultrasonic vibratory cutting tool that cuts the core, whether it's clay, boulders, cobbles, cuts through it pretty much like butter until it gets hung up for one reason or another. And in fact, the fun part is when it's really in action. It's not a silent endeavor, but as they're getting toward the actual spudding of the hole, they're just entering our manually excavated effort, and it's relatively simple. That's what it looks like as it's going down hole, and that's what the center of the earth would see. Let me get out of that and go to the next. Once the cores come out, they actually are extruded into plastic bags, and this is one of the first ones we saw. It's about 10 to 12 feet that's shown there. There's my toe for scale, and it's about a 6-inch diameter core barrel that comes out. This is extruded out, and you can see it's a clay material. It's right off the bat, as expected. A good amount of sand, but it's not yet saturated. And this is at 12 feet below ground surface. Just below that is where we encountered the perched aquifer. And what I liked about seeing this, one, we predicted it to be there, and indeed was. It is indeed saturated, and it is indeed very gravelly. And this only is from about 14 to 16 feet here in this image. But the lithology is very similar to what we see in the bed of San Antonio Creek, right adjacent to this, where we monitor and showed you in a few slides ago. Below that perched aquifer, very big, thick, fat, dry clays. And this extends for hundreds of feet. In fact, you can see my machete there on the right side of this image. We had to hack into that clay to break it apart. And it's I call it my Costa Rican field hammer, largely because it's a tool that we use in Central America quite a bit, but of course here as well. And in this case, for rock hammering through the cores, which come through very tight. The sonic drilling definitely heats up the core material as it goes through. And if there's small amounts of water in something, it tends to dry it up, but it also smears and compacts the clay. So it's pretty tight. But if it's very tight down hole, like it is in this case, this perching layer, this clay that underlies the perched aquifer and extends downwards for over 100 feet, effectively has no water in it. It is tight as can be. It is strong as can be, and it's relatively dry. As we get deeper, we get into other aquifers. There are some intermediate ones that appear dry, but really this is the mother lode. This is the main aquifer of the Ojai Basin at this location. And we punched through it at about 288 feet. So you're looking at about 3 feet of this cuttings material, well-rounded sandstone clasts, ranging from sands, coarse sands for the most part, up to these gravels and cobble sized materials. So once we saw this, that dry material, the borehole was relatively dry. The 10-inch casing had sealed out the perched aquifer system, and the inner casings just didn't have a lot of water to pick up in the intermediate zones. We screened them anyway, as you'll see momentarily. But once we hit this 288-foot depth and penetrated that main aquifer, the water level rose instantaneously up to about 50 feet below ground surface, indicating the confined conditions that we were expecting, and really supported both the hypotheses of the isolation of this zone from what's going on above, and the intensity of the aquifer to deliver water in a relatively quick punch. It was one of the reasons that we went with sonic drilling for this, because if we were drilling rotary methods, we wouldn't know where we were hitting water. You would have drilling muds and you would have that mess, and you'd really have to be guessing while drilling, at least, if you're in some saturated material, based on cuttings returns, based on fluid mechanics and dynamics that are happening at ground surface, and then indirectly measuring via geophysical tools. So really the sonic drilling had so many benefits to this. Here's what we expected to see. This is based on the E-log from the Hansen well that's all of 150 feet away from the depth discrete monitoring well. And we were saying that we had 5 potential priority casings in order of priority. The top one was the perched aquifer, and the second was through that production aquifer. And we were expecting, based on this E-log, that we'd have a minimum depth of 280 feet. That was what ABC Leoven based their bid upon. So as we expect, we had the footage numbers that would go over and some day rates and such. And as we speak, we're hammering out the the final invoice from the drilling contractor. But it's all certainly within the budget of the grant that we have to spend on this endeavor. We ended up going down 330 feet with the bore, so it's a little bit deeper. And instead of having 5 casings, we had 4. We have our high priority perched aquifer casing that is actually screened from 14 to 24 feet. We have our main major producing aquifer screened from 288 feet to 328 feet, and 2 intermediate zones where we saw gravels that didn't appear to be saturated, or at least didn't induce a rise in water levels. And should these dry up, it would certainly be no surprise if they are indeed encased within the clays and isolated from recharge. But if they do have water, of course, it may be seasonal and ephemeral, and we'll see how that changes over time with respect to quality and water present in these wells. Now, of course, what you're looking at here are 2 different scaled drawings, graphics of the as-built, as-designed, final design of the depth discrete monitoring well, and our preliminary design with, of course, a significant depth of penetration into the main aquifer. We didn't go as deep to that 600-foot depth, largely to save on costs, and because of the cobbles that were present and the significant amount of clay, it was really grabbing on to the core barrels and to the sonic tools. So you had some much resistance and slower drilling than expected. In fact, we were thinking this would be a 5-day endeavor, and it ended up taking about 8 days to get this done and done right. So if I put this back to scale, this is about what we're looking at. We went down, we may actually have 2 zones within the main aquifer if we trust this correlation, and we encountered effectively, of course, the perched aquifer and the intermediate pretty much spot on based on those correlations. The deeper zones 1 and 2, we'll see how that changes over time, but pretty pleased with what we expected and what we ended up coming up with. Once it comes time to actually install those wells, these are 2-inch PVC wells with 20 thousandths of an inch slots and a very fine sand pack, just to make sure that we're keeping the fine material of the formation out of the production stream of these monitoring wells and keep them from clogging. These are relatively small. They're all manually installed. These guys are running these down the hundreds of feet with screens installed as built down an open borehole through a borehole that is supported by those 10.5 or 8-inch diameter casings that are providing stability, but also were used for drilling. Once all those are in, the seal goes in, all the gravel pack goes in the prescribed locations, and the seal is poured under inspection. Ultimately, you've got a nest of 4 monitoring wells. There's actually a gravel feed tube in case it's right here, the narrow diameter that actually also goes into the perched aquifer zone, just in case there's any settlement of the sand pack within that zone, owing to some bridges and voids that occurred in the clays underlying that perched aquifer system. This is what you got if you were to go stand there today. The monitoring well fill port, safely securing each of the casings, and should be hard to get into. We'll put locks on those caps inside of that, of course, because we have some $2,000 worth of logging equipment down hole now, and we'll actually add to that so that we can have direct read cables. But while we're waiting on those, we will continue to collect data. So what does it look like this week? That perched aquifer has a depth to water of 13.18 foot. You've got the intermediate shallow aquifer with a 43.53 foot to water. And these are pre-development, so these may change as we start pumping on these wells. The intermediate deep aquifer has a 52.05 foot depth to water, and the main production zone 51.06 feet to water. This is all referenced from the top of that vault, which is roughly ground surface. And of course, when they're all done, that conscientiousness that helped us out with ABC Leoven, they cleaned it up pretty well. One of the last photographs we took during the demobilization portion of the project, they still had their forklift there that was rental, and I think the rental company was coming to grab that and the portable toilet that's just in front of that. And so no one had to make use of the trees. They actually had a facility there. So we're pretty pleased with how this project went along. We're still ongoing with it, and we'll have more to report next month, but very excited about the whole process, and really the hypotheses of the perched aquifer being significantly disconnected from the main aquifer is absolutely positively proven here at this point. And we'll continue to monitor that and correlate that out to the outlying areas of other production zones, and importantly, the surface water within San Antonio Creek. All right, so that concludes that presentation. Thank you for your time on that one. I know that was lengthy, but happy to take any questions.
Oh, that was great. Yeah. Go ahead, Bill.
Jordan, did you have an expectation of how thick that clay layer was going to be versus what it ended up being?
I did have an expectation that it would be that thick. My surprise was really how dry it was, and really how fat and impermeable those clays were.
All good news.
Yeah, we might have we'll have a core barrel to show that's to scale of the entire stratigraphy, and that'll be very interesting to share in person when I'm right there next month. That's where you're on my screen. But there's a couple where we have a guy holding the cores. It's a gray clay core, and he's holding it over his shoulder like a yoga mat. Wow. It's just holds up that strongly, and it's indicative of the low permeability of that zone and the capacity to separate the perched aquifer from the main production zones.
That's wonderful news, and sort of try for all of us. In terms of a bit of a follow-up, what's the best way to package this information for the court on the bifurcation hearing?
Yeah, and that's really not the intent of this, although those who have access to the data.
No, it's not the intent, but it's relevant.
Yeah, it's highly relevant. It's highly relevant. Our job, and the OBGMA via the granting entity is owing a very comprehensive report which we will provide, and be able to share that with anyone and everyone who will listen. But again, the longer term data that we collect, the more defensible it becomes, the more we learn about it, both with respect to quality and quantity of water within the system, and how it is flowing from the headwaters to the recharge zones and into the various aquifers, definitely stratified within this basin.
But certainly impressive the extent to which your intuition is proving to be validated by evidence.
Well, thank you. But intuition comes from looking at something for 20 years.
Yeah.
And it's a lot of this has been intuitively obvious. It just takes a lot of time and effort and the support of many others to really get this kind of thing onto paper.
Anyone else have any questions? Emily?
I just wanted to know if those diagrams are going to be, are the diagrams going to be available on our website with the meeting notes? Okay. Just be good to share that with other people if needed.
Yes.
Thank you.
Anyone
course.
else? Jordan, do you know what's the relationship between the water level in the perk zone that you observed and the fault line, the overflow?
The elevation wise,
Yes.
so we're still well above that. And that's one of the graphics that I showed there. I can pull it up again if you wish. Let me actually go there.
That's okay. It's hard to see here, so.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I can give you the number here. But the elevation, and this is again rough pre-development, and we haven't had an elevation survey done, so it's
Yeah.
sort of based on Google Earth elevations. But the perched aquifer water level is about 725 feet or so. The spill point elevation is just under 640 feet. So we've got a very significant, it's the highest delta between the perched aquifer system and that at elevation. The main aquifer system and the elevation at the key well and within the nested well itself is still about half that distance higher, but the perched is the highest and certainly the most correlative to the San Antonio Creek and its spill point.
All right, thank you. Does anyone else have any comments or questions? All right, thank you, Jordan.
Thank
That
you.
was good. The next item is public comments on items not appearing on the agenda. We have anyone on Zoom or in the public that would like to comment?
Before we leave this item, I would ask if there are any members of the public on Zoom, we'd appreciate you letting us know who you are and who you represent, because this meeting, we are talking about our groundwater sustainability plan, and we want to make sure that we record those members of the public that are observing this meeting.
Hi, this is Derek Reed. I'm with Dudek. I'm just supporting Trey and Devin.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. All right, the next item is consent items. We have one item, the minutes from the May 27th board meeting.
Move approval. Oh, I don't, yeah, for the consent items.
Do I have a second?
I second.
Call the roll.
Director Arriaga?
I wasn't here, so I think I'm going to abstain, although I didn't see any issues with it.
Director Warwick?
Yes.
Director Daddy? Director Daddy?
Okay, I think I'm unmuted now. Yes.
And Chair Hages?
Yes.
Oh, then Director Thielke?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, item 8, action items. 8A is the treasurer's report for May.
Just give you a few brief comments. Let me get to it, apologize. Our beginning balance was $168,098. We had income of about $8,300, a little over $8,300. Total expenses of about $9,241 for the month. So we have an ending balance of about $166,000. The revenue was small. We're hearing that we're at the end of the quarter, so we don't see a lot of revenue typically for this quarter. I know Roberta's getting ready or has sent out extraction statements or will be pretty quick. So we'll be expecting to see more revenue starting next month. So we had a net change in cash position of about $2,093. And the disbursements, you can look at that. If you have any questions, let me know. And just on the extraction charges by period, I went back just briefly to look at those, and I thought it was interesting to point out in 2018-19 fiscal year, for the first two periods of the year, we had 1,335 acre feet. For fiscal year 2019-20, for that same period, we had 1,717 acre feet. And for this year, for the first two periods of 2020 and 2021, we had 1,949 acre feet. So we are seeing an increase in the use in the basin over the last 3 years, and that's in the same period. Now, certainly I understand weather affects that. A lot of reasons affect that, but it's a trend that we see going on the last 3 years.
Well, as a user of the basin, I'll say that, yeah, we've only spent, 3 weeks this year not irrigating?
Yeah.
But I think we might see some drop off. Some of the wells that are up on, the edges of the basin are starting to spit a lot of air. So, I think the revenue for the last 3 months will be high for OBGMA, but then we might see people pulling from the lake, sorry. But some of us are about to turn off the pumps and start using casitas, which is sad for June.
Yes.
Usually that doesn't happen till late July, August, so. It's
Okay,
gotta
that's-
rain.
That's all I have.
Any questions or comments? Have any questions or comments from the public? Can I have a motion to approve the treasurer's report?
I so move.
I'll second.
Call the roll.
Director Wyrick?
Yes.
Director Ayala?
Yes.
Director Thielke?
Yes, yes.
Director Daddy?
Yes.
And Chair Hages?
Yes.
It's unanimous. Thank you.
Item 8B, Groundwater Sustainability Plan, review of draft chapters 1, 2, and 3.
Trey, you're on.
Good afternoon, Chair Hages and board members. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Terrific. Let me go to the slideshow. And just so I have a general sense, are there any stakeholders in the audience today that aren't on Zoom?
We have one.
Yes.
Yeah. And we know who it is.
Okay, thanks. I just want to get a sense of the audience for the presentation. So today we're going to go over Groundwater Sustainability Plan chapters 1 through 3. To give you an overview of the entire plan, the GSP is organized into an executive summary and 5 chapters. The executive summary provides a plain spoken language overview of chapters 1 through 5. Chapter 1 provides an introduction to the GSP, including a purpose of the GSP, sustainability goals, agency information, and the notice of communication. Chapter 2 provides a plan area and basin setting, and also discusses the safe and sustainable yield approach. Chapters 1 and 2 have been made available to the board, and also I believe those have been posted to the website. Chapter 3, which we will be getting into today a bit, covers sustainable management criteria. And then chapters 4 and 5, which will be discussed at upcoming meetings, describe the projects and management actions and GSP implementation. So for chapters 1 and 2, we put together some overview slides. These slides are living documents for upcoming workshops or board meetings with stakeholders. We can present these again just to get everyone up to speed. So it really provides a high-level overview. So the purpose of the GSP, we really haven't changed anything from the original mission of the Ojai Basin Groundwater Management Agency, which is to preserve the quantity and quality of groundwater in the Ojai Basin in order to protect and maintain the long-term water supply for the common benefit of the water users in the basin. And then because we also have to take into account SGMA requirements, the GSP is also intended to meet the overarching sustainability goal of SGMA to operate the basin within its sustainable yield without causing undesirable result. So this really is a sustainability policy statement, and it's something for the board to consider when they're commenting on chapter 1. Obviously, the GSA is a sole GSA comprised of the Ojai Basin Groundwater Management Agency, 5-member board, and the legal authority for the GSP stems from the SGMA law, but also stems from the original Senate Bill 534. The Groundwater Sustainability Plan has been developed for the Ojai Basin as required by SGMA. It's designated by Department of Water Resources as a high priority basin. The legislative intent of SGMA is for groundwater to be managed sustainably in California's groundwater basins by local public agencies. The Bulletin 118 boundary of the basin is outlined in blue, and the GMA boundary is in green. They pretty much match except for some areas to the north near the Topo Topo Mountains and this one area here towards the west, but there's no groundwater extraction wells in these areas, so the basin is effectively managed. And we're basically, for the plan area, we're using the Bulletin 118 basin boundary as the plan area in the GSP. So that really is the summary of chapter 1. I'm sure some of you may have some comments on the text, but if you have any questions with that before I move on to chapter 2, I'll take those now.
Chair Hayes, in the interest of time, would it be best just any comments we have on any of these chapters, just to email them to you, Mr. Monday, and would that be the best way to, okay.
Yeah, if you want to get them to me, I'll make sure that get it to Dudek.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thank you. And then for chapter 2, I think we've covered most of these in previous meetings. I think more of the discussion we want to have today is in chapter 3 with the sustainable management criteria. So I'm going to fly through these pretty quickly, but if you have any questions, feel free to interrupt. Again, the plan area is the Ojai Basin. This figure shows in tan the contributing watershed. It also shows the adjacent basins, the upper Ojai Valley Basin, the upper Ventura River subbasin. There are outflows from San Antonio Creek that occur to that basin. So we do have to have some coordination as required by SGMA with them, but it's really pretty small. I think it's just probably comparing our outflows with the inflows reported by upper Ventura River. As we've described in previous board meetings, this is the basin hydrological conceptual model. I think in the interest in time, I'm going to skip this slide, but if there's any questions, let us know. I think we've covered it in detail in the past. And Jordan did a great job of describing these fat clay aquatards that separate the four principal pumping zones in the basin. Those are typically up to 100 feet. Obviously, as we get towards the west in the basin, we get in more of those perch conditions. When we're at higher elevations in the basin toward the east and north, we have more of an unconfined condition. There's been some recent information put together as part of the State Water Resources Control Board work, so we plan on updating this cross-section in the future. This really gets into the historical and current monitoring network in the basin. Currently, there are 18 wells monitored by Ventura County quarterly. 6 wells equipped with data loggers, including now the multi-completion well at San Antonio Spreading Grounds and the new completion well that Jordan spoke to earlier. The GMA regularly monitors wells, especially the key well, to track groundwater level trends and groundwater in storage. This really presents a historical overview of groundwater levels. We've covered this at length in other meetings, but again, near the key well here, all-time basin low occurred in 1951 at 580 feet above mean sea level. The high occurred in 1978 at 854 feet mean sea level, so almost 300-foot change over that 27-year period. Jordan spoke to where these groundwater levels are today. This slide provides an overview of total dissolved solids in the basin. Interestingly, there's 2 water quality objectives in the basin for total dissolved solids. To the west of Senior Canyon, San Antonio, it's 1,000 milligrams per liter. And to the east, it is 700 milligrams per liter. Right now, we have it demarked at 0 to 500 and 500 to 1,000. I think this is one update we'll make to the draft just to make it a little bit more clear in terms of where the water quality is currently in respects to the water quality objectives. A Mann-Kendall analysis that we performed of data available from 1981 shows that there's no increasing trend for total dissolved solids except for one well, and that's the Gorham well. So it seems to suggest that there doesn't appear to be an issue in regards to water quality for total dissolved solids. And then, of course, in Chapter 2, we do describe other constituents, but in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to land subsidence, which, again, we've discussed in previous board meetings. Between the period 2015 to 2019, 41% of the basin has experienced subsidence between 0 and 0.21 inches. 59% has experienced uplift between 0 and 3/4 of an inch. The average displacement within the basin is an uplift of 0.16 inches. As we previously discussed, we don't think there are any undesirable results occurring in the basin historically or currently from land subsidence. As Devin summarized nicely last week, last board meeting, we went over the groundwater dependent ecosystems, and we, based on a desktop level of study, We have summarized those into potential groundwater dependent ecosystems, which are the yellow areas mostly on the fringe of the basin. Potential groundwater dependent ecosystems not likely impacted by groundwater extraction. For those areas, the normalized derived moisture index and vegetation index showed no correlation with pumping. So as Jordan described in his presentation, that likely could be because of this perched layer that occurs, which is in this hatch line. That's the estimated extent of the perched aquifer. And then for the priority potential DDEs, there needs to be additional study. And we did see some correlation for some of these habitat areas that require field investigation. As we've summarized again in previous board meetings, the water budget between 1971 and 2019, groundwater extraction simulated by the Ojai Basin groundwater model averaged approximately 4,100 acre feet per year. The simulated change in groundwater storage during this period was approximately negative 15 acre feet per year, which is within the model uncertainty. Overall, this suggests, since we have a balanced water budget over periods that include dry, wet, and average, and the cumulative change in storage, which is this black dotted line, it is pretty much back where it was, at least at the end of 2019, where it started in 71, that we don't see an overdraft condition occurring. The model estimated a lower pumping than what the GMA has previously estimated, which is around 4,900 acre feet over this period. So we really think that this is the lower end of the safe yield, and that we're going to use some future conditions, the simulations we're doing right now, and also consideration of the sustainability indicators to further discuss what the sustainable yield of the basin is in the future. That was a pretty quick overview of Chapter 2. I know there's a lot of details in the chapters themselves. If we have any questions with Chapter 2 before we jump into kind of some of the discussion on Chapter 3, let me know.
Anyone have any questions or comments?
I had a quick question on when I linked to it on the OBGMA website, I didn't see all the diagrams, and was I missing something? All the text is there, but not all the.
I don't. You posted the chapters that were sent to us? Yeah, these are slides, I think, that are separate from the chapters that were developed. Is that true, Trey?
Yeah, that's correct. But I think her question is specific to the figures for chapters 1 and 2.
Right.
And I believe they are not yet posted to the website.
Okay, thank you.
That's all the figures are combined for chapter 2. It's only about 13 megabytes. And chapter 1 is one figure. So you should be able to go ahead and post those.
Yeah, it would make it easier to understand as people read through it.
Okay, so you sent those along already?
Yes.
Okay, I need to look at that.
And my next comment was, I think it would be good when we send out the OBGMA billing to maybe throw a little slip of paper in there and say, we've posted these chapters. If you're interested, please look them over and get back to us and sign up for our email list. I think we really need to engage the public right now. They're not going to read 180 pages or whatever in November. If they read it and comment as we go along, it'll make our lives easier. That's all.
Okay.
Anything else?
Oh, thank you for that comment. I would just say that these the slides that you saw here for chapter 1 and 2, they're kind of the cliff notes I flew through that. If I did that presentation to the stakeholders, I would take probably 3 times as long to go through all the specific details of each slide. So if you have any comments on those initial slides, let me know, because we will be revising them for future meetings. And then as we jump into chapter 3, which hasn't been presented yet, we're really getting into a lot of policy discussion. So just be aware of that as we kind of shift gears here.
I had one comment on chapter 2. I have others, but just one I want to bring here, open up. There's a statement on page 2-21 that agriculture is the most water-intensive land use in the OBGB. Are golf courses actually less water-intensive than agriculture? I'm not sure about that fact.
Well, if it's collective.
Golf courses possibly be
collective or-
more water-intensive than agriculture? And I mean, this is a statement of fact here, and
Well, as a
Right.
group, as a collective group, or as an individual operation?
Well, I noticed that the golf courses and the school properties are listed under facilities in table 2-5. And then that's followed by the statement that agriculture is the most water-intensive land use. Is it true that agriculture is more water-intensive than the golf courses?
I think we'll have to take another look at that particular statement. We could look at it from a standpoint of per acre water use for a golf course versus different types of ag. So we would probably, if you make that statement, you'd probably have to look at the average water use per acre in the basin for all the ag versus a golf course. So we may want to kind of revise the reporting of that to make it a little more clear.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I would think on the surface that most of the ag, I think Director Finch has indicated, they're on drip systems.
Exactly.
And golf courses and
Are not.
landscape are going to be spray irrigation, so.
And we have a fair amount of golf course acreage
Yeah.
in the basin. And I just thought we ought to note that we ought to be careful with a categorical statement like that.
Good question.
Or are they just trying to say that that agriculture uses the most groundwater?
Right.
Well, so let's just change the sentence to say that.
It said water intensive, I think. We need to
No,
make sure
yeah.
about that.
It varies widely on what you're planting. If you're growing lettuce, which nobody is on the east
Right.
end, yeah, you'd use more water, but again, it would be a short-term crop, so,
But I'm thinking of turf versus drip irrigation of citrus.
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's 2 issues. Which is the most collectively the largest user, I think, is ag, but what is the most intense
Water
user?
intensive is a different,
Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah. Okay.
Anything else? Okay, let's go to chapter 3 when you're ready.
Thank you. So I think this is where we kind of get into the meat of SGMA with our sustainability indicators, which we've discussed in previous meetings, but we really haven't gotten into the sustainable management criteria. And that's the sustainability goal, undesirable results, minimum thresholds, and measurable objectives. As defined in SGMA, the sustainability goal means the existence and implementation of one or more GSPs that achieve sustainable groundwater management by identifying and causing the implementation of measures targeted to ensure that the basin is operated within its sustainable yield. Apologize, my lighting went out here. The GSA must adopt a non-quantitative sustainability goal or goals that set the framework for determining what is significant and unreasonable for each applicable sustainability indicator. These goals are primarily policy statements that communicate the GSA's vision for sustainable management of the subbasin. So as I described earlier as part of Chapter 1, the overarching sustainability goal is to preserve the quantity and quality of groundwater in the Ojai Basin in order to protect and maintain the long-term water supply for the common benefit of water users. This GSP is intended to also meet the overarching sustainability goal of SGMA to operate the basin with a sustainable yield without causing an undesirable result. This is a policy statement. Certainly, this is something the board should consider if they want any revisions to. We don't necessarily have to discuss them right now, but definitely I've identified all the policy in this chapter, and just want to make sure that as we go forward that we have developed sustainability for each indicator recommendations, but if there are comments on them, feel free to bring those forward. So for groundwater levels, conditions within the basin can be considered sustainable when the following sustainability goals are met. Groundwater levels are at or above historical lows, and pumping reductions are implemented based on the water efficiency and allocation program stages. For reduction of groundwater and storage, conditions are sustainable when the following sustainability goals are met. Long-term aggregate groundwater use is less than or equal to the basin's estimated sustainable yield, and pumping reductions are implemented based on the water efficiency and allocation program stages. For water quality, conditions within the subbasin can be considered sustainable when the following sustainability goals are met. Groundwater quality as measured in municipal and domestic water wells generally exhibits a stable or improving trend for identified contaminants of concern or meets Title 22 drinking water standards. Established basin agricultural, domestic, industrial, and municipal supply uses. And feel free to comment on any of these as we go through them.
Yeah, could we just back up a little bit when you state that we'll follow the allocation and efficiency plan or program? What are you referring to? Water efficiency and allocation program, yeah.
Yeah, that's the WEAP program. So essentially, and we get into that some more with the minimum thresholds and measurable objectives, but that's the conjunctive use of Casitas water with groundwater and storage, and the 5 stages that are currently within the groundwater management plan, where when you hit those different stage numbers 1 through 5, there are prescribed actions to take place. So for instance, if you start to get into a drought, there's an initial voluntary reduction in pumping, and then there's a request at one stage to reduce pumping by 20%, and so on as you get into the higher stages that are associated with drier periods.
Okay, and these will be tied to groundwater levels.
Yes, exactly. They're tied to groundwater levels, and therefore also tied to groundwater and storage.
Okay, I just think it could be a little confusing in referencing using the same nomenclature that Casitas uses, because it's a set of different standards for different reasons. So, you know, I'm not familiar with any particular water efficiency and allocation program that this body adopted.
Yeah, that confused me as well. I thought you were talking about the Casitas WEAP program,
Right.
which I don't think this agency should be following
Yeah,
one particular agency's.
at first glance, there's a conflation there.
Okay. Thank you for pointing that out. you'll see in some later slides that we're kind of recommending managing them conjunctively, but if that's something this board wants to manage separately, we certainly probably need to rewrite some of these recommendations for the sustainability.
Well, I think there is an interest in managing them conjunctively. I just think they're two separate things. I mean, you could have a situation where Lake Casitas is at 30% and the basin may be not in that bad a shape, so.
Let me jump ahead a couple slides where we did have one table that kind of shows so this is the table which shows the and we jumped ahead to measurable objectives, but it shows for both the groundwater basin and Lake Casitas the storage capacity, the minimum threshold for each of those, and then there is in this case a volume in acre feet associated with each stage. So greater than 80,000, you're in stage 1. Stage 2 is 72,000 to 80, and so on. So for each one of these stages, there essentially would be a signal provided to the pumpers in terms of obviously at stage 1, you're free to pump, and as you go down up the stages, voluntary reductions, potentially requests for 20%, and then so on as you get into the higher stages.
Well, I think that's fine. I just think that this organization should adopt that as its own, whatever we want to call it, water efficiency allocation plan or whatever, with its own goals and objectives, because it is excuse me, it is confusing. It sounds like the basin is in sync with the lake level, and that's not necessarily true. I mean, we easily could be in a situation where the basin is low and the lake is relatively full. I mean, that I think could happen, probably the most probable circumstance.
Right. So you could have the basin in stage 4 and the lake could be in stage 2. And you may have just specific signals to the basin for stage 4, but obviously what you have available in the lake may inform what the agency does.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't have a problem with it. I just think it should be a separate policy that is clearly ours and has our own markers as to when we implement these various stages. Because we haven't done that. This was kind of used in another document as an example of how we could manage the levels with an allocation program. It was never really adopted as a program, to my understanding anyway.
I don't think it was, and I wholeheartedly agree. I think we need a different nomenclature from Lake Casitas's, and I don't know what that would be called, and maybe just a different nomenclature even for the stages so that the general public isn't confused between the two of them, because they're quite separate. And yes, we will probably follow similar scenarios, but I think it's important to make sure from the get-go that the two aren't confused, for sure.
Trey, could you go back to that slide for just a second? I want to make when I look at this, I look at two different things. I'm getting two different results. My understanding is that OVGB is in stage 4. My understanding right now, Casitas is stage 3. Is that correct? It's something where somebody is going to take a look at what water availability is, conservation levels are, severity or criticality, the critical supply of water, and they're going to get two opposite gauges to look at. So what I understood is we were less than 64,000 in the basin, and so that would put us somewhere in stage 4. And my understanding is Casitas right now is stage 3 for what they're having us conserve. And I don't understand how the general public is going to be able to relate those two.
Yeah, I don't either. I think the other is we've never declared these any kind of a stage. Historically, my understanding, the basin has been regulated by the simple fact that as the level goes down, the ability to produce water declines, and we switch to Casitas. So it's kind of a self-regulating allocation plan. We've used voluntary reductions, particularly in the last drought, that were fairly successful, but there wasn't any allocations issued, and there was no stage declared. So I think this is a major policy issue. I think the board's going to have to discuss on what it wants to adopt and how it would implement that. Because Bob's right. Right now, we're moving towards stage 4 probably, and we have no policy to address that. Yeah, we're in 4.
And Trey, could you go back to the one graph that shows the total solids? There we go. Yep. There we go. I'm really not sure what the results are going to be as far as this chart goes. How often we're going to put, if this is the objective, I don't really know where the numbers are going to be and where they're going to be available to people. But I kind of take a look at this thing here as the Salton Sea. The less water we have, the higher these numbers are going to be across the board. And I have no relationship to this number. I understand that's a number that it was established for us for Title 22. I don't know where we are in relationship to that. And I don't really know where this thing gets to. And I don't know what the ramifications are. So if we get up to chloride west, and that number is 400, is there some type of a trip switch that says, hey, you can't draw any more water because the more water you draw, the more chlorine, and the chlorine's probably not a good indication, but let's take the sulfates. What is the relationship to us continuing to pump, continuing to get a higher concentration, continuing to get a higher yield? And is there something that tells us here's where you are and here's where you go, and then as a result of that, stop? Because I'm just trying to figure out what the severity of this little graph is, if any. If it's not important, for the sake of time, move on. You can just send an email, and that's fine.
Yeah, I could just say that when we're looking at water quality in particular, that we want to see if there's a nexus with actual groundwater extractions in the basin. And if we just take TDS or even any of the constituents, when we did the trend analysis for all the municipal wells going back to 1981, we're not seeing, except for one well, any increase. So that suggests that groundwater pumping in the basin over that time is not affecting water quality. That's a pretty simple analysis, but there is an interrelationship between this GSP and other water quality programs, such as drinking water standards or basin plan water quality objectives. The GSP isn't meant to supplant those existing regulations, but I think what we're trying to do here is just recognize that there are other regulations established in this basin already.
Okay, so is there a way we'll know, or is there something that will give us an indication if we're getting close to any kind of a red flag or any kind of a firewall in this thing? I mean, have we got plenty of margin where this is something that we really can set out of our mind for a while?
I would say probably for most constituents, for total dissolved solids, you are approaching in some areas of the basin, and we should probably separate this distinction between basin-wide and localized issues. But in some areas of the basin, we may be approaching some of these water quality objectives, especially for total dissolved solids in specific wells. But the average TDS basin-wide is around 800 milligrams per liter right now. Again, I just want to emphasize that we also do not see a nexus with groundwater extractions and increasing concentrations currently. Okay. So there's really not a specific action that this agency could take that would necessarily improve these water quality issues. They could be related to septic return flows or ag return flows. They don't appear to be directly related to groundwater pumping.
Okay, thank you.
I think rather than having this little bar chart, let's make a graph of what we've seen over time in the two areas, along with listing what is the drinking water standard,
right.
and then set our, make it be a graph of some kind where you can see what it has been, what the drinking water standard is, what the trend has been, and what we, put a maximum level that we would be concerned at. Because this little graphic doesn't mean much to me. It's just confusing. It says, oh my God, one side of the valley's worse than the other if you just look at it, which doesn't have any correlation to drinking water standards or a trend over time, or I don't know. I think there's a better way of showing that, what we want to say here.
Right, and just to clarify, all the Chapter 3 slides today are just meant to elicit discussion about the policies the board wants to enact in the GSP. We'll have different slides for our stakeholder presentations for Chapter 3.
Okay. Well, I'd like to get back to the nasty issue, and that is pumping allocations. I mean, that is not something that we have really dug into. Again, we look at the historical record, and it appears to be somewhat self-regulating. It's just like Emily just mentioned a little while ago. She's going to have to start taking Casitas water on one of her properties, which is a normal condition when the basin goes down to this level. So is there a way to satisfy our goal and avoid the undesirable results in ways other than individual pumping allocations?
Sure, I think those they wouldn't necessarily be allocations per se, maybe more voluntary reductions. So it seems that what I'm hearing is there may be a physical constraint about pumping when the basin reaches certain levels. But I think when you think about those stages, instead of saying, oh, you're only allocated X per well, that you just simply say we're in stage 4 right now, and we're requesting a voluntary 20%, and I'm just using an arbitrary number, reduction in pumping. But that's just a hypothetical example.
Richard, I think you need to review those stages because you're at 68% and you're in stage 4. Does that make sense?
Well, that's true.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's where you'd start. And I think years ago when we debated that, we never got beyond that. And that was just sort of a starting point.
Okay. Yeah, we've never talked about those numbers at all.
No, years ago we did, but 68% and being in stage 4, what does that mean? Does that mean we can only use half the water?
Right. Yeah, and the other problem with this basin is that some wells will naturally be reduced,
They do, yeah.
while others may continue to pump at their full amount for quite a while. So, is that a condition we want? I mean, do we want to deal with that? I mean, you'd have to have allocations based on where the well's located. And,
Historical use of each well.
yeah.
I mean, because it doesn't make sense to cut off the people in the lower basin, like the Casitas wells, when they'll have plenty of water, whereas I'm on the edge, and historically, I've always been cut off in July or August. Just by natural, it's a bowl. I'm on the edge of the bowl, and some of those people down in the lower part of the basin might not have a big enough allocation from Casitas or even be hooked up at all. My property on Reeves Road being that example, I don't have any water other than my well. I'm not gonna tell the dogs and people that live there that they can't drink a full glass of water every day. I mean, it has to be based on where
Yeah.
you are to some extent, historical use, which is a lot of data.
Yeah, it's been a natural conjunctive use since Casitas was built.
Yep.
That's why it was built, and it just kind of naturally took place. And like Emily said, where the well's located, each one's different. So it would be very difficult to come up with some uniform plan. I think, we could probably come up with a stage or whatever condition, that we can declare for public consumption that we're in, some stage of a dry period and everyone should be cautious in their water use. But other than that, I don't know what else we could do other than have a very complicated and probably unsuccessful allocation plan.
Something expensive to administer as
Yes,
well.
to say the least.
Just a quick comment, Roger, if you have any more comments during the meeting, we'd certainly appreciate it, but if you could make sure you speak to the mic so our Zoom audience can hear it. Okay, thanks.
Well, I certainly appreciate those comments. I mean, what I'm hearing is that rather than managing on some sort of individual level, you'd want to manage to the basin scale through these stages, and they would most likely be, for the ease of implementation, they would be voluntary requests for reductions, and the plan itself might not really take into account the localized conditions. It's really just a basin-wide description of how the agency is going to manage during different stages of groundwater and storage.
Yeah, it's in a simple way, the way this is worked primarily started in the mid-'80s is the Casitas Water District encouraged groundwater users to use as much groundwater as they possibly could when the basins are full and not use Casitas water. And then Casitas is supposed to promise them they'll have water when the basin is low. It doesn't always work out, but that's really how it's been for almost 50 years, and it works, obviously. So some way to formalize that, I guess, is going to be the I mean, we've always talked about a formal conjunctive use agreement or plan with Casitas as part of this, and that would be something, that we could develop as part of our first 5-year implementation plan, I would think, because it's not going to happen before that. But that's always been the idea, is to come up with a conjunctive use plan where we make the most efficient use of both supplies.
Well, I remember one year, and I think it was 2014, we sent letters out to all the pumpers that asked for 20% reduction, I think it was. And we went from over 5,000 acre feet down to about 3,500. And I'm sure it wasn't just all cutbacks, voluntary cutbacks. I'm sure some of the wells lost production, but overall there was a significant reduction by the basin, and I think people took it to heart here. And so I think voluntary programs initially are certainly the way to start.
I would just
Chair,
add
go
that
ahead, Emily.
economics helps. I mean, Casitas water is vastly more expensive than it ever has been. And there could be, again, it would have to be on a well basis, historical use. If you go, 10% over your historical average use, that you get charged more on your statement to OBGMA, or, that's in the long term. But yeah, money talks too. So,
Chair, what, now that we have a single supplier, we're not competing with Golden State anymore. How is the coordination between Casitas and our Casitas facility in the riverbed going to work? Is Casitas developed a plan that says when the water level gets to a certain area, what they're going to do is they're going to cut back, or they're going to cease, or they're going to fractionalize pumping out of the fields there and draw more water at least for the city of Ojai directly from the lake? Have you developed a plan? Because what I've been told by farmers is when Golden State used to turn on the water, they weren't able to pump next door.
Yeah, there's been, we started some of those discussions, and then our lawsuit pretty much interrupted all of that. But yeah, that's why I say I think it could be part of a future implementation, because we have talked about that. I mean, with Casitas' ability, they could pump a considerable amount of water when the basin's high with the facilities they have. So they could produce more water when the basin's high and have less impact on everyone else, and then possibly be the first one to cut back when the basin begins to draw down. So that kind of a conjunctive use agreement, I think, would be the kind of thing. It would be one of the easier ways to manage the basin rather than dealing with each individual pumper. I mean, we talked about the whole idea that Casitas could basically is a throttle. I mean, they can throttle up and down, and they're, not quite yet, but once they're finished with the upgrades in the system, they'll be able to throttle up and down in their production much easier than anyone else, and with the least economic impact. The difference in the cost of producing groundwater and producing lake water is minimal. Anyway, those are the kind of things we've talked about, but again, we haven't gone into any great detail and started any real negotiations on that. But I think it could be something both parties, both Casitas and the OBGMA, have a desire to do. So we could include that in, future implementation. So you think you can work with that?
a lot of
Well,
information.
Certainly glad we didn't completely start writing chapter 3 yet, because there's a lot of institutional knowledge that we need to incorporate into that chapter. And really, this is kind of where all the policy is in the GSP. So I'm glad we're having these conversations.
And while never adopted, I know Roger Essick was here at the time. Jordan did present, I think, kind of a plan to look at reductions in the basin. And so that's something that maybe Jordan could share with Trey and share with the board again, give us an update and see if there's any interest in that.
Yeah. I would
Me
just,
too.
I would just caution you that that's a big bite to try to get done before January. So hopefully we can come up with something that's a little more general with some promises to do more later. Because otherwise I think it's going to be tough to do.
Another sort of follow-up question. In terms of the protocol of how far to look ahead in this groundwater sustainability plan for things that aren't yet available but will be in the foreseeable future, I'm thinking of the Carpinteria connection. Is that something to speculatively incorporate into this GSP, or is that too far ahead or outside the protocol to talk or think about?
Trey, I think part of this, as I recall, we're supposed to put together some concept of projects that we envision in the future. Is that correct?
Exactly, that's chapter 4. So
And that's not a project of OBGMA, but through a conjunctive use agreement, it would be relevant.
It could be. And I think, I don't think they'd have to necessarily be GMA projects.
Okay.
But I think we could certainly identify regional projects that could benefit the basin.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. And I think we could probably talk about some minimum level targets and a list of things we may do when we reach those, like, asking for voluntary conservation, coordinating with Cayugas or Casitas, to reduce pumping during some period. I think there's a variety of those kind of things we could do, and we could adopt targets that, initiate action on that.
yeah, this stuff is really interrelated. In terms of the time frame, typically the planning horizon is 20 years, but obviously that can be super high level when you start going out further in time. And then I think we certainly, at least from this discussion, have maybe identified a potential project and management action, and that would be the planning of a conjunctive use program with Casitas. So rather than describing that in detail in the GSP or attempting to, we simply would put that to after GSP adoption. You would just potentially scope that out a little bit in terms of what that would involve and what the cost would be. But it would be super high level. You wouldn't have to go into any detail in the GSP per se.
Yeah, I would agree with that. You've got a GSP deadline that's coming up in January of this coming year. But in terms of management actions, you would identify the management actions or potential management actions in the GSP. Doesn't mean you'd have to actually adopt and implement those management actions. Is that consistent with your understanding, Trey?
Exactly. You would just have potential projects and management actions. So even if you identified them, you wouldn't necessarily have to implement them, especially if they weren't going to result in an undesirable result for any of the sustainability indicators in the basin.
If we were to adopt a minimum level, as if we exceed that, it's an undesirable result, and have some, hopefully we never get there, but we could adopt some actions for this plan that are fairly severe. For example, if the 1951 level is as far as we agree as far as we're ever going to go, or if it's a little higher than that, then if we ever start to approach that point, we have kind of the doomsday plan that we would suspend pumping completely and rely on Casitas. I think the groundwater model shows that there's always about 1,500 acre feet of recharge occurring, so we could set 1,500 acre feet as the doomsday limit on how much you could pump until we recover from that. but it would almost happen by itself. So I don't know that it would be that tough of a thing to adopt as a policy. You know, it's kind of the thing you never want to happen, so, and hope it never does. But at least we have something where we can say we're going to avoid that undesirable result.
Trey, go ahead.
I think that's a good segue into undesirable results. In the interest of time, essentially, instead of reading this, the undesirable result does have to take into account the interest of beneficial uses and users of groundwater and land use. So it's really up to the locals to decide what's significant and unreasonable. In another basin, a well losing production or not being able to pump at certain months could be considered significant and unreasonable. But from what I'm hearing is that that's just a phenomenon of how this basin has been managed for decades, and that, an individual well going dry isn't necessarily an undesirable result. Groundwater level declines are significant and unreasonable if they are sufficient in magnitude to lower the rate of production of pre-existing groundwater extraction wells below that which no longer meets minimum required to support overlying beneficial uses. I think we can strike this last part about the water efficiency and allocation program. Obviously, I certainly got the message on that, but I think essentially you're trying to support existing pumping in the basin, but it's a little bit trickier in this basin in that, and I think this is how we were trying to incorporate the conjunctive management, is that during dry periods, this basin switches over to Casitas water. So I certainly would appreciate, I don't know, we have to go in and revise text now, but any comments on this when I send out the slide deck, and I'll revise it to take out the WEEP program and make these a little bit more clear and maybe revise them based on the conversation we had today.
Instead of using the word pre-existing, you could just change it to historical groundwater extraction. Because we are used to this up and down during summer months, the edges go dry, and that's a historical, we've got that data. I don't know, just throw that out there. When you revise it, you can throw the word historical into it.
Okay, noted.
Yeah, and another undesirable result would be if a well, like Emily was talking about, that historically has never gone dry, and doesn't have Casitas backup, that would be a level that we would not want to exceed.
Yep.
Has that occurred in the last decade or so?
No.
Shouldn't, if we're going to put that, if we're going to be putting some changes in, maybe one of the things we need to put in to explain that, yeah, this is what the historical use is, but it hasn't occurred within a decade. So we don't, I just hate to add more stuff when other people are looking. It just brings more questions and more scrutiny. And I just soon give them the answer to not look. If you can figure out maybe how we can throw that in there. Like, we're concerned, but it hasn't happened.
It hasn't happened, and it is one of the fears that some of us farmers have with Casitas being hooked up to the system now. One of my fears is that Casitas pumps like mad during the wet season, supposed wet season, and lowers the basin such that then during the dry season, that area has been pumped a bit more than perhaps it has historically, and then it dries up faster. So that's my concern with the, over pumping the municipal wells. or anyone could come in and increase their pumping during the wet season and do that if land use changes, or, I don't know. I think it needs to be based on historical use. I don't want to go, I worry about land use changes and pumping changes that veer from what has worked in the past. It has worked in the past because it's been self-monitoring.
Yeah.
Okay, enough said on that.
Well, I guess if a well that does not have a backup supply goes dry, that is an undesirable result. And to our knowledge, that hasn't happened since Casitas was built. So simply having that as an undesirable result that we're going to avoid, I mean, it seems to me a reasonable thing to do. So we can have a relatively, because there's few of those wells, is my guess, and they're all located pretty much in the same area, we could develop a policy on what action we would take if it appears that those wells are threatened, and identify a basin level where that threat may occur. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does, absolutely.
But since it's never happened, I don't know that it's necessary to have some huge action plan. Simply the ability to identify that it might occur and then have some general plan to deal with it.
Director Hodges, I think that we need to be a little careful. I don't disagree with the approach. I just think we need to identify specifically where the wells are that we're talking about. And maybe even which wells, specifically identify the wells, as opposed to just saying any well that doesn't have a connection to Casitas supply, or any parcel that doesn't have a connection to Casitas supply. If the well goes dry, that's an undesirable result. I think if we're going to craft an undesirable result around this, we have to be very specific about it so we don't get into an unintended consequence.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a very well-defined area where these wells are. And there's a lot of historical data related to those specific wells. So I think we can differentiate between wells on the fringe that may run out of water frequently, and these wells that have never historically run out of water. There aren't that many of them, I don't think.
Yeah, and I think Jordan could give us we could decide on a groundwater level for several of them or all of them, or, yeah, they're wells that are monitored, so I don't think that would be hard to do. Good.
Thank you. Those were great comments. We'll certainly take those into consideration and work with the board to craft something that works a little bit better for this local basin. The undesirable result for groundwater and storage is essentially the same as groundwater levels. So I think we've kind of talked this through, and I think that we certainly need to consider this localized difference between fringe wells and other wells in the basin that don't get impacted during dry periods. I think the concept under SGMA really is that you want to consider the beneficial use and users of all the pumpers. So just because a well that has historically gone dry on the fringe is losing their production, that shouldn't result in all the pumpers having to stop pumping. So I think what the GMA has been doing is fine. We just have to, I think, indicate as such in the GSP, so that if people make comments to Department of Water Resources, that we've kind of recognized how the basin's being managed. So for degraded water quality is significant and unreasonable if the magnitude of degradation of water quality from pre-existing groundwater wells precludes the use of groundwater for existing overlying beneficial uses. Again, we could say, I think we were just trying to differentiate that if someone just drills a new well in the basin and goes, deeper or in some area that typically wasn't used, we're not having to address that. But I think it is the idea that you're preserving, again, the existing beneficial uses in the basin. Subsidence is significant and unreasonable if the magnitude of subsidence due to groundwater extraction interferes with land uses, such as damage to infrastructure. This is just pretty general. As we previously indicated, we're not establishing minimum thresholds or measurable objectives for land subsidence, since it hasn't been identified as an issue. Depletions of interconnected surface water is significant and unreasonable if the magnitude of stream depletion results in adverse impacts to aquatic resources and groundwater dependent ecosystems. An example is in-stream flow requirements. I'll just add that, this is a data gap in the basin currently. Jordan was explaining how the GMA is trying to fill this data gap currently, but right now we don't foresee that we're going to have any minimum thresholds or measurable objectives established for this draft or for the GSP that's due in January. And this just provides a quick summary of undesirable results applicable to the basin. It doesn't appear that under historical conditions, which we describe in Chapter 2 as being 1971 to 2014, that they're significant. We do again have the data gap for interconnected surface water. Current conditions, either not applicable or not significant. Again, a data gap for interconnected surface water. And the future conditions without the GSP implementation, obviously this basin's a little bit different than other basins where you actually do have some management such as metering in the basin. We don't think that it would be likely significant or not applicable for seawater intrusion or and again, finally, we have the data gap for interconnected surface water. As we started to discuss a little bit today, projects and management actions to implement to meet the sustainability goals, rather than this water efficiency and allocation program, probably would go ahead and potentially consider voluntary pumping reductions or a conjunctive use study with Casitas. And then obviously for interconnected surface waters, we have ongoing and additional study. Are there any additional comments on the undesirable results? Minimum thresholds are the quantitative measure of undesirable results and are set at individual monitoring sites or a combination of monitoring sites. These thresholds will be established in the GSP based on an analysis of how they would impact beneficial uses and users of groundwater in the basin and the determination of undesirable results for each sustainability indicator. Maintaining groundwater levels above historical lows is being proposed for inclusion in the GSP as the minimum desired threshold for groundwater elevations that would be protective of beneficial uses and users in the basin. For our discussion item, should we make consideration for a buffer below historical lows if appropriate during extreme droughts? And then on the right here, we have 9 wells in the basin that, at least for the annual reporting to DWR, would be used to likely determine minimum thresholds. And what we were thinking is that a majority of the wells would have to be below the groundwater level thresholds established for all of the wells in order to be considered an exceedance. In some other basins, they're even considering that groundwater levels would be below those thresholds for 2 seasons in a row before it was determined to be an exceedance. With that, is there any discussion on the minimum threshold for groundwater levels? And then for groundwater and storage, it's essentially for all those wells, it's the volume of groundwater associated with those levels. So on here, we do have listed some of the wells, their well depth, the top of the screen, bottom of screen, the reference point elevation, and there's just a draft minimum threshold in feet below ground surface and a minimum threshold in, I believe this is elevation. So this is just an example of a well network and how a minimum threshold would get established for each of those wells, and that it wouldn't necessarily be that if you had one well exceed the minimum threshold that the whole basin would exceed. It would be most likely that a majority would have to be below, and that you could even include that it would have to be below for more than 1 year. Do we have any comment on that?
Well, I think it seems to me it would be the best way to do it for this basin would be to take the wells that are in the major production area of the basin, which is relatively small and includes Casitas' wells, several agricultural wells, and those would be the wells that if the basin goes below a certain point collectively, based on those wells, then that would be an undesirable result. Because if all of those wells continue to pump, we could exceed the historical level. That's what's going to happen. The impacts on the basin when we get to that point are going to be relying on a very small number of wells, all located in pretty much the same area. So there's really no point in having, this little basin-wide set of triggers when really the impacts are going to be seen right there near the Casitas wells primarily.
I mean, this circles back to the discussion we just had.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There are 2 different sets of wells that are relevant here.
Yeah.
Right. I think that's a fair point, and I think that certainly for your monthly reporting, you might not be monitoring the same network of wells for your required annual reporting to DWR. And I think you certainly could design the program such that the majority of your wells are in your major pumping areas, so that, by default, you wouldn't exceed the threshold unless those wells dropped below. But that said, I think at least for the annual reporting, not necessarily the monthly analysis of the basin, that we may want to consider having spatially wells distributed throughout the basin, especially when we're looking at these annual required calculations in changes in groundwater and storage that likely are going to have to be a little bit more involved than what was being done in the past in order to meet the DWR requirements. But I'm hearing you. I definitely think we can identify some additional key production wells that should be included in the establishment of minimum thresholds.
Trey, I think the point that the board's trying to make is on this map that you've got up here, you've got a couple of wells in the middle of the basin, and then you've got a bunch of wells on the periphery. And as I understand it, those wells on the periphery are going to go dry in a normal year relatively soon, in July and August. This year, even in June. Emily mentioned that point. And the wells in the middle of the basin are going to remain healthy and can continue to pump. And this is just a normal, natural way that the basin works, given its shape, essentially. It's shaped like a bowl. And so, the discussion in the GSP has to account for that. And minimum thresholds have to be assigned so that, if some of these peripheral wells were to go dry, it's not an indication of an undesirable result.
I'm just jotting that down. Okay. I understand the issue now that you describe it that way. So there are specific wells that we have included here that, while they may be potentially monitored for groundwater levels or included in some technical analysis of the basin, that they wouldn't be the wells that would be identified as key wells for the minimum threshold. And I would suggest that probably Jordan's the best one to let us know which wells we should most likely include in that analysis.
Trey, is it possible to identify that industrial well? I'm been here for a long time. I'm not familiar with industrial stuff out there past Carn Road. What would that possibly be?
I think it's Bacali's well that is for the restaurant there.
Okay, well, kind of be
high
nice.
level industry.
Kind of be nice to know, because if the Bacali well goes dry and that's all he has, that in itself would be a big problem. But
yeah.
I think it would kind of be nice for me, and don't do it for me, do it for maybe the people that are going to be talking to us about this program. It would be nice to have a different color, I don't care what it is, that have wells without a connection to Casitas. So we can see where those things are geographically. Because we're talking about it, and I get this vague idea of I don't know. So I don't know how much problem that is. I don't even know how many there are. Are there 5, 20, 50? I don't need an answer right now at all. I'm just saying I don't want us to have gaps in our presentation when we go to the public. We get a whole bunch of questions, which is we'll be back with an answer. That just makes this process go forever. So just, if that's something you can do, I am extremely familiar with this ground. Over the last 25 plus years, I insure a number of thousands of different properties in the valley. And there are still some of these I can't figure out where they are. So just...
Yeah, we certainly can get the parcel layer or parcels that Casitas serves and overlay that with the wells to determine which ones at least would have access to Casitas water. I don't know, does the GMA have potentially a list of wells that are not served by Casitas? Sometimes when you get on the ground, it's not as, or it's a little more complicated than a GIS analysis.
Yeah, I don't know if we have anything like that.
I'm not sure.
I know Casitas would have the parcels they serve, but
And we may be able to correlate that with the pumpers that we have in
yeah.
our database.
I mean, it couldn't be that many wells. I mean, you think we're talking about 25 parcels that have groundwater use only?
I doubt that there's very many at all. The only thing there could
too.
be is, Emily's gone now, but I think what she was referring to is she may have a parcel that has a well that serves agriculture and maybe a small meter for domestic. I don't know. I mean, it could have that situation. But I can't imagine there's that many of them.
I would think not, and I would want to be very careful of having a single one of those trigger one of these unfavorable conditions at all. I mean, I would really want to make sure, because, I mean, when I'm looking at this draft product, it's pretty interesting. Maintain levels above and have a buffer below. That's the easiest way I see that happening is just designate those that don't have Casitas, that have gone historically dry on a routine basis over 25 years, and make sure we don't use those in any type of our, basis for having an adverse, declaring an adverse effect in the basin, because that's normal. Those things are going to be normal. Those wells come in, those wells come out every single year. What I'm concerned is when we get that blue dot in the center that's having some problems, then that is critical. Then that's absolutely going to be the highest level of concern that we're going to have. But having them up on the rim, my clients run out of water in lots of areas all the time. So I hope I made that clear. I want to make sure that there's only a couple of wells that we're really concerned with. And the rest are going to be temporary. And the consequences for probably 95 or 99% is they just turn on the spigot to Casitas. And I don't think that we're going to have 5 or 10 of these properties where they can't get Casitas and they don't have a well. I think it's going to be very low. And I certainly don't want to put that in as a reason for us to have to take any action. That's all.
Understood. We'll certainly incorporate that into Chapter 3 draft when we start writing that. So again, this is the minimum threshold for groundwater and storage, and we just developed some initial draft information of the well screens, the reference point elevation, and the minimum threshold depths. We'll go back and revise these based on the input we received today. For water quality, for municipal and domestic wells, this means water quality that meets potable drinking water standards specified in Title 22 of California Code of Regulations. For irrigation wells, water quality should generally be suitable for agricultural use and meet basin plan water quality objectives. Let me know if we have any comments on that.
I think that's pretty clear.
Yeah, didn't you answer that on the one where pumping really doesn't have an effect on the quality? We did that on that graph or that grid a while back. So This is,
Right.
that's answered, I think.
For land subsidence, we've concluded the degree of land subsidence occurring in the basin is minimal, has not substantially interfered with surface land uses in the past, and is not anticipated to substantially interfere with surface land uses in the foreseeable future, including within the GSP's planning and implementation horizon. Therefore, this GSP does not propose minimum thresholds or measurable objectives specific to land subsidence.
Yeah, that was an easy one.
Depletion of interconnected surface water affecting beneficial use. Additional data acquisition and monitoring, including field surveys, are needed to refine the understanding of interconnected surface water and ecosystem dependence on groundwater. It is currently unclear whether depletions of interconnected, that should be surface water, or impacts to groundwater dependent ecosystems are occurring in the basin, and thus a minimum threshold is not currently being proposed by the GSP. And this text over here just kind of citing some stuff we put in chapter 2 that, you know, basically is saying that the information is not well constrained and there's a data cap. And what we're essentially recommending for surface water interconnection and groundwater dependent ecosystems is that, you know, project and management action be identified at an upcoming meeting to further constrain surface water groundwater interactions. And obviously, you know, from the first presentation today, some of that work is ongoing and needs to obviously be written up, and we'll incorporate as much as we can into the GSP of that ongoing work. But, you know, the overall conclusion is that there isn't going to be a sufficient amount of work completed by when this is due in January to develop a minimum threshold for GDEs or interconnected surface water.
Trey, I fully get where you're going with that. I do know that there's issues going on with the Ventura River adjudication, and I'm just putting it out there to the board and to Jordan. You know, if we take the position in the GSP that there's insufficient data to really opine on this issue, is that going to be inconsistent with where some folks want to go in the basin adjudication? Just throwing it out there for discussion.
Okay,
you know,
Peter,
this is going to become a public document, and you know, it already is. But anyway, if that's the official position of OBGMA, that could have implications.
Peter, wouldn't it be best for us to absolutely get a recap of the first couple of days of the week? But maybe I'm naive in this, but my understanding is that if the channel keepers are not a party to this, and we no longer have the steelhead, and we no longer have you know, the 12 CFS, whatever they're looking for, and that's not a part of this surface water, and now that has been set aside and dismissed. And now what we have is the city of Ventura pursuing an adjudication. My understanding is they're not pursuing adjudication or water rights for surface water or for riparian area or for steelhead flow. I can be way off base, but I think this is just plain old water theft where they're taking a look to take a piece of the pie. And I don't believe that there's any wildlife left in this issue. So, you know, somebody's going to have to get in that thing. It was very long and gruesome for my reporter, and he's been doing water for a few decades. And so I think we kind of look at that, because I think that this adjudication thing is the leopards has changed the spots totally. This is just Ventura wanting water. That's what I get.
Well, Peter, I don't understand what would be the alternative. I mean, we're basically saying we don't know. If we don't know, we don't know. I mean, what else could we say?
Well, okay, so I guess that is exactly it. Certainly further work is ongoing, it needs to be done, but would it be better to say what we do know or what the existing data suggests, as opposed to just saying we don't know and we're going to study it?
Yeah, we could certainly address a preliminary reporting and include that to the extent it's defensible and the board has had a chance to review our initial reports on this, and include, to the extent is appropriate, within this upcoming draft GSP. And I think, Trey, maybe we can just work together on that and see how you want to incorporate that into your into the GSP.
I appreciate that, Jordan. I certainly think that, we can describe the base, and we have to some extent in chapter 2 already, the basin setting and the perched aquifer, and that there doesn't appear to be a nexus of pumping with many of the areas identified as groundwater dependent ecosystems. It gets a little bit more complex in terms of groundwater surface water interactions and stream flow. I think Jordan's been collecting the data now for some time that's beginning to build the case that it doesn't appear that a majority of the pumping is impacting those flows. But when you're looking at establishing a minimum threshold, you're probably looking at either a groundwater level at a specific well near or adjacent to a stream, or you're looking at stream flow. I just don't think at this point in time that we're going to have sufficient data to establish what that level is. I think that it was really fascinating what Jordan presented earlier. Certainly, it looks like you've got this bifurcated system where you've got a perched aquifer, much different groundwater levels than that deeper aquifer. It'll be really interesting to see whether those deeper piezometers see a response to pumping in the basin, and what kind of response you get at the perched piezometer. But I don't think we're going to have sufficient data over 6 months to make some sort of ultimate determination about that. I think you're looking at collecting several years of data, and we simply would say that, at the 5-year update, that if it was appropriate at that time to develop a threshold, we would do so then. But we certainly don't have, in my mind, we don't have sufficient data to develop a threshold. We could certainly, suggest that it doesn't appear to be a major impact to groundwater dependent ecosystems and depletion, but it's kind of hard to make that leap. I think we have a good theoretical understanding of what's going on, and I think Jordan has understood that for a while now. It takes time to collect that data, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
And once we have it, we can make that final leap.
Let's present the data we have, conclude what we can defensively, and incorporate that into the GSP, noting that this is a plan and has a plan action that will continue that monitoring and establish those long-term trends. So I like that approach, Trey.
Thanks, Jordan. I agree.
Yeah. So I agree too. I appreciate that, Trey. And so maybe this is not the correct section to be doing this. Really, maybe a more robust discussion in chapter 2 is the place to do it, with a reference to it here.
Certainly, we want to, in the basin setting, further describe the ongoing work and further put forth our conceptual understanding of how groundwater interacts with surface water. And I think Jordan will have a lot to add based on his.
Chair Hages?
Yes.
I don't want, we're getting long on this, but I do want to point out that I think it's very important to fully draw out the implications of the bifurcated aquifer system. For example, some of the proposals for physical solution are proposed physical things like a rundo depletion don't affect production, affect the perched aquifer level. Things that could be done by the city of Ojai in terms of increased recharge is primarily from the hardscape is primarily the perched aquifer system. So I think the idea that unclear to me is as Mr. Candy says, a bit problematical when the evidence seems to be accumulating quite rapidly on the fact that this is a bifurcated system, and that has all kinds of different implications for the definition of thresholds. But it certainly begins to be looking like there's a vast range of production levels and that have absolutely no effect on surface flow, and that needs to be that the evidence is pretty clear that that's the case, and that needs to be acknowledged or stated. Anyway, I'm just
Yeah. No, I mean, as strongly as we can support that argument, the better. And, with the information that we had today, it appears to be enough at least to bring it up as how we define how the basin works.
right. I mean, it's incredibly important to state clearly that support of surface flow in San Antonio Creek can be helped by measures that really have nothing to do with production levels.
Yeah.
Well said.
Well, I just want to do a time check. It's getting at 5:30 here. I think all the comments on minimum thresholds certainly apply directly to the measurable objectives, which are a quantitative measure of the sustainability goal. Again, there's just like the minimum thresholds, they're set at individual representative monitoring sites that are preferably those selected for minimum thresholds. If conditions at the monitoring sites meet or exceed the measurable objectives, the subbasin is at the desired groundwater condition. So, in summary, for groundwater levels, groundwater and storage, they're just different levels. We were associating those with the stages that we previously discussed. We may want to kind of go back and reconsider some of that, but it just gives you an idea for specific wells, what stage you're at. And it's really more like a dashboard indicator, your fuel tank, what are you empty? Are you full? I think that's really the gist of it. I don't know that at this point we need to go into the measurable objectives for each sustainability indicator. We're basically going to be incorporating all the comments we received on the minimum thresholds and updating these for each sustainability indicator at this point in time.
Okay.
So we had developed those for each. They're really the same for water quality. And then, there's none for land subsidence. Again, I think we just discussed an approach for depletion of interconnected surface water. And with that, I think we're on to the timeline and next steps. Before I move on, do we have any other comments on the sustainable management criteria for Chapter 3? And I certainly do appreciate all the dialogue. It's really helpful for us to have that information before we start digging into writing that chapter.
Yeah, it appears that chapter is going to be the most effort for you and for us, so when we start taking a look at the timeline, that's probably going to be the most critical thing. That's the critical next step. So it's kind of up to you when you think you're going to have something that you can provide to us for review.
Right. We were essentially, I believe, in our timeline, anticipating a month to prepare that chapter. But, in the meantime, we were proposing to further identify projects and management actions at an upcoming board meeting in July. That could be a special meeting. And then following that, we were proposing to evaluate project management actions and estimate cost of plan implementation for the July regular board meeting. Concurrently, we would be preparing Chapter 3 and proposing to have a draft of that chapter in about a month. And then in August, Chapters 4 and 5, which are the projects and management actions and plan implementation, they're much simpler chapters to do than Chapter 3, obviously. But yeah, I think the big lift right now is Chapter 3. So in August, 90 days prior to adoption of a GSP, you have to provide a notice for that meeting. So we would do that in August. We were anticipating an in-person workshop shortly thereafter, either late August or September. At that point, we would have, summary slides, the cliff notes, if you will, for all of the chapters. We found in other basins that that's very helpful. Many people don't want to read through hundreds of pages of a GSP. So if we can, concise that into 20 or 30 slides, that's what we were proposing to present at a workshop. Then in late September, October, we would have the 30-day public comment period. And then once that was done, we would summarize the comments received on the draft GSP at a board meeting. The following meeting or special meeting, we would provide response to comments and any suggested edits to the draft GSP. And then in December, around the 15th, that's when the public hearing would be held to take comment on the GSP and adopt the GSP for submittal to Department of Water Resources in January of 2022. Are there any questions with the tentative schedule here?
Do you think it's possible to have a draft of Chapter 3 by the July 29th meeting?
Yeah, I think a month. I don't know that every last detail is going to be buttoned up. I think at least having that draft will be useful to really narrow and focus on what we need to discuss. But that may be more of an internal administrative draft. I'm not sure that we will want to release it to the entire public at that point in time. But I think that's really up to the board and GMA staff whether that should go out to the public.
Well, if you have a July 23rd here as release of administrative draft, do you think you can meet that? That would give us a week at least to decide whether we wanted to.
Yeah, I think we can have certainly an internal draft for the board to review by the 23rd.
All right. Then we can decide from there whether we want to have another public meeting or not, or if it's ready for that. I think it's gonna take some time for the board to review, and it may take more than one public meeting even to iron that all out.
I agree.
John, do you have any issues with the schedule?
No, I think the prior board memorandum I put together really just talks about your regular meeting calendar and not to speak to special meetings.
Right.
But within that, I think that in whether you act on this tonight or not, it's not that important. But take a look at my memo. There's 3 issues that I need the board to consider. We have to coordinate with the city calendar. So if there's special meetings, then I need to go back and make sure there's not any problems. I've looked at the city's calendar for the remainder of the year and compared it to the OBGMA regular calendar. Doesn't appear to be any problems. The OBGMA board needs to discuss what they want to do for November and December meetings. And then you also need to discuss whether you want to continue at these 3 p.m. versus 5 p.m. meetings, because it used to have 5 p.m. meetings. I personally, I like the 3 p.m.
3 p.m. works better.
Yeah, and I
It's
think
less conflict with the city, too.
less conflict, and because a lot of the city meetings tend to, if they have commissions, are at 3 to 5 or 6.
Exactly, yeah,
So-
3 works better there.
So I don't think we need any action on this tonight, but I'll bring it back next meeting. We talk a little more about it, and I'll work with Trey when he tells me he thinks he needs to. We have a special meeting. I'll get with you, Chair Hages, and we'll figure out when that can be, and we'll get with the rest of the board and figure out what date is good for everybody.
Do we think we need one in July? Early
Well, I
July?
know Trey mentioned a special meeting in July. What was that for, Trey?
That would be for identification of projects and management actions.
Oh, okay,
So
all right. So that's not the July meeting, but that could be a special meeting.
that could be if we need it, but it might be worthwhile if we don't have a special meeting, is just potentially having the board and GMA staff start to compile a list of possible potential projects and management actions, and maybe have that list available for the board meeting on the 24th if we don't have a special meeting, and be able just to whittle it down to the priority ones that should be included in the GSP.
Okay, all right.
It's all right
Yeah.
with me.
Yeah, we can do that.
Okay?
And based on the conversation today, we'll start a list of projects and management actions and circulate that to you, John, and
Okay.
Chair Hages, and from there we can build.
Once we get to a point, we can get to the rest of the board as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah. Okay, good. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Trey. And Jordan.
Thank you for bearing with us on sustainable management criteria. That's always a fun one.
Yeah. I knew this was too easy. All right, the next item is the auditor engagement.
Can I have a quick question on that? Is that normal to be pretty much in a 2-year behind? That's normal?
Well, it's a 2-year, we're required to do it every 2 years.
Right, but I bet when this is completed, we'll still be 2 years behind
Whatever.
Well,
in September. Is
Yeah,
that kind
but-
of normal? In other words, we don't go to September 2020, we go to September 19, and then it gets done in 21 and,
yeah, we were behind.
22.
The previous 18, 19,
Okay.
17, 18 were behind. We're behind on this, so we want to get this done, and then it won't be long after this is complete. We'll
okay.
be working
We're
through
going
the
to do a
next one.
catch-up after this is
Do
done.
another one and get caught up.
Okay, all right, got it. Thank you.
And part of the problem's been, it's tough finding an auditor that's willing to do this small
Nobody wants to
agency.
do the small fry.
No, they don't.
No, we're too small to matter.
And so the previous auditor doesn't want to do OBGMA, and so we found this woman, and I've spoken with her, and she's willing to do it, and you
Okay.
see her proposal, and
Okay.
I'd suggest moving forward.
Sure, thank you.
So I have a motion do we need a motion to do that?
Please.
Yeah, I still move.
Second.
Call the roll?
Director Barber,
Yes.
Director Duffy,
Yes.
Director Daddy, Director Daddy,
Yes.
and Chair Hages.
Yes.
It's unanimous. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, if there's no other business,
Yeah, and I've asked for 8F to be pulled. We'll bring that back at a later date.
yeah.
Okay, all right.
And we're adjourned at 5:46.
Let's not make this too regular.
This is not the time to
But
say.
I do thank the board, and I
doing
appreciate their
Oh, this
valuable
isn't a good
input. So
example.
this is an important
See how
issue for the
exciting
area.
it is.
Yeah.
Thank you all very much.
Thank
Thanks,
you, everyone.
Jordan.
Thank you.
I think next year won't be quite as hectic.
I was just kind of, I don't know what we can do to get this guy to stay though.